The 90s were an absolutely fantastic era for RPGs on home game consoles, with 16-bit systems like the Sega Genesis, TurboGrafx, and Super Nintendo releasing much more expansive and immersive experiences than what was possible on the hardware of the previous generation. While I cut my teeth on the first Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy games on the NES, it was really the SNES that solidified my fondness for the genre in my early teenage years, especially with classics like Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, and Ogre Battle consuming a lot of my free time. But these days, I want to dig a little bit deeper, of course. So let's try another alphabetically constrained exercise in examining some of the lesser known but still fascinating titles on the system, all while keeping things as spoiler-free as I reasonably can. Some of these are old favorites of mine, and some I had never heard of before starting to make this video. So equip yourself as necessary, and let's delve into the dungeons of overlooked RPGs on the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom from A to Z. And first up in our list today, A is for Arcana, released in 1992 in Japan and North America, with the Super Famicom release being titled Card Master. It was developed and published by HAL Laboratory, fresh off of their near bankruptcy after making the very ambitious visual novel Metal Slayer Glory for the Famicom. And Arcana was their first RPG created after being absorbed into Nintendo's corporate ecosystem. Arcana didn't quite see the success of HAL's later work on the Kirby, Smash Bros., and Earthbound franchises, just to name a few, but it's still an interesting piece of history for the studio and a really solid dungeon crawler on the console. Now, deck building enthusiasts, don't get your hopes up, however. Despite the characters and monsters all taking the form of cards, it's mostly just an aesthetic approach and plot device, with the main character Rooks being the last living card master, who may be the world's only hope against preventing the resurrection of Rim-Sala, an evil empress who had once reigned over the land of Elemen before being defeated and sealed away by Rooks' ancestors. At its core, it's a first-person dungeon crawler with turn-based combat and random enemy encounters, and the first-person perspective also generally carries over into the nearby towns and character interactions there. Rooks is often accompanied by other party members which weave in and out of the storyline throughout the game, but also has control over an elemental spirit character, which can eventually be swapped out to best fit your situation and exploit certain enemy weaknesses. Not unlike many other dungeon crawlers of the time, Arcana is a little notorious for some of its unforgiving aspects. The areas to explore can be rather expansive, with tons of turns and dead ends, and pretty frequent battles to deal with. Luckily, the game does have an auto map, but that may be one of the only comforts here, as you can only save in the towns, and sometimes you may need to consider turning back to get to safety before losing a bunch of progress to a game over, which can easily occur if just one of your human characters dies, so a sudden surprise attack from a big mob of monsters can really ruin your day. To make matters a little worse, there are even boss fights that can pop out without much warning as well, so those risk-averse may want to take some extra time to grind out experience and some gold for better equipment and restorative items. If you want it to get a little worse, you have a fairly limited inventory as well, so you can't just load up on herbs and be good to go. And in yet another reason to grind, the game is split up into chapters, so you can't go back to easier areas to level up. And these challenging aspects may either make you wince or squeal with masochistic glee, but either way, Arcana is generally a pleasure to play, and could actually serve as a nice introduction to the dungeon crawler genre thanks to its simplicity and straightforward approach. The graphics and atmosphere are also really nice, if not a bit repetitive during long dungeon diving sessions, and with some nice little animated monster sprites as well, and I'm really fond of the soundtrack. It's definitely worth a look, and for an honorable mention here, maybe check out Alcahest, HAL Laboratory's action RPG on the Super Famicom, if you want something more hack and slashy. And it also starts with A, how about that? Now, while it's taking every fiber of my being to not gush about Brainlord for the letter B, instead I dug up something I hadn't heard of before, and which never officially came to the West. Bushi Seiryuden Futari no Yusha, which roughly translates to Warriors Legend of the Blue Dragon: The Two Heroes. It was published in 1997 by T&E Soft, and one of the final titles released on the Super Famicom, and developed by Game Freak, a name you probably recognize as the creators of the Pokemon series. You control a young swordsman in training on a quest to rescue your sister, who is kidnapped by the Ocean God, and you soon team up with a girl who is transformed into a small flying monster fuzzball. Where things get really interesting here are the game's wide variety of perspectives and gameplay mechanics. You've got some top-down Zelda-like moments, complete with cutting grass and collecting valuable gems, and first-person conversations, which even let you look around a bit and examine things a little more deeply. And a 2D side-scrolling platformer view for combat, which is actually turn-based. Each step or action you take uses up a turn, and any monsters on the screen will also take their own turns. You have a standard attack, a shield for defense, which can also fire off a weaker projectile, several special attacks that can be charged up, and your flying friend can also carry you upwards short distances, or even fend off or distract other enemies. There's a lot you can do, and you're well rewarded for figuring out how to win these confrontations in as few turns as possible. It's a really unique combination of ideas here, which can be a lot to take in at first, but thankfully the game gives you some pretty helpful and thorough tutorials early on to get you started. And even more thankfully, someone made a translation patch for this, and it's fully playable in English despite the lack of any officially localized release. Now, obviously Game Freak would go on to be rather busy with Pokemon stuff, and since it was such a late release for the system, it's not a big surprise that it never came out in North America. But I'd say it's a deep cut worth checking out, with a lot of nice visual polish and rather innovative hybridization of gameplay mechanics. And we have another Super Famicom exclusive here with Chaos Seed, a wild hybrid of multiple genres published by Taito and developed by Neverland, the team behind the Lufia series, and eventually Rune Factory. It has elements of action RPG, building simulation, and real-time strategy, all wrapped up in rather complex gameplay with lots of depth, and can be admittedly overwhelming at first, but it's a fascinating blend of ideas going on here. The narrative places you in a dying world where you are tasked with restoring energy to various dragon veins to bring things back to normal, and you'll need to build underground caves to extract the necessary resources to do so. As you expand and build more rooms, you have a wide range to pick from with various end results, including rooms that can increase your production capacity, summon creatures to help you in your cause, rooms for excavating items, or rooms for teleporting around. Unfortunately, the humans up above ground think you're up to something nefarious, or perhaps they're up to nefarious things themselves, so they'll be continuously sending hordes of soldiers your way, which you can fight in real time, or also set up your own attack rooms and traps to keep them from destroying your lair. The combat is even surprisingly deep, with a variety of attack maneuvers, although it does get a bit chaotic at times depending on how much is happening on the screen at once. Now, over the course of several rounds, you'll basically build and upgrade your cave until you have enough excess energy to pour into the Dragon Vein and move on to the next scenario. I may be drastically oversimplifying things a bit here, as there is a pretty vast amount of different ways that you can approach problems, either with how you upgrade and arrange your rooms, or grow your horde of creatures and task them with various jobs like repairing damage or redistributing their energy, or equip them with items. And even beyond that, Feng Shui even comes into play a bit here, with each room having a potential element depending on its placement, and the overall arrangement will affect its potential efficiency. Now, if you're confused already, don't worry, same here, honestly. Even after a lengthy tutorial at the start of the game, it will take a lot of experimentation and probably a little online research to start getting the hang of things. And admittedly, I haven't made it very far into this one yet. But the gameplay is so unique for its time that I think it may be rewarding if you're willing to invest some effort in understanding its complexity. And there's a very well done English translation patch, fortunately, or if you can handle reading Japanese, you might want to check out the Sega Saturn version as well. For letter D, here's one very near and dear to my heart. It's Dragon. This is one of the first RPGs for the console in 1991, although it was originally released on Amiga and Atari ST, and also ported to a handful of other computer platforms as well. CRPGs ported to consoles often get a bit quirky in the conversion process, and this is no exception. But it's an old favorite of mine anyway, mostly thanks to its absurdities and surreal atmosphere. The plot is something dragons, go get some gems. While the original version's got a nice supplemental story with the help of Gary Gygax, the SNES port instead gets rather muddied, as it was originally in French, translated to Japanese, and then translated again into English. The game starts with you rolling some stats for your 4-person party, consisting of a fighter, scout, mage, and priest, and you're quickly dropped into an open 3D world to explore, and can view a quick tutorial before setting off. The tutorial and instruction manual will be a big help here, as the setup here is a bit odd, with real-time auto battles where you can toggle certain basic tactics, and a point-and-click-ish interface for interacting with environments of the indoor castle areas, where a lot of parts of your quest will advance by talking to or fighting with the many half-dragon, half-human royalty of the realm. But a big highlight for me with this game is just how strange it is. The atmosphere is very moody, thanks to some really striking music exclusive to the SNES version, and the day and night cycles outside are also a really nice touch. There are tons of bizarre monsters to encounter, with unintentionally hilarious grunts, clunks, and booms in the combat sequences. The game is also a bit on the brutal side sometimes, as wandering off into certain areas too early will spawn some beasts much stronger than you, or even if you're appropriately leveled, you can still quickly lose a party member or 4. Or perhaps your favorite armor will just get melted off of your body. Or maybe you'll just get eaten by a moat shark. So make sure to save often. It's quirky to say the least, and I guess I mostly suggest this one for anyone not afraid of a little jank, but once you get the hang of a few interface things and study the manual a bit, I consider it a very memorable experience. It even got a much more normal sequel eventually with Dragon View, which is a very cool beat-em-up action RPG hybrid that still has a nice 3D overworld as well, and that one is also definitely worth checking out. Maybe one day I'll do a deeper dive with a video on both of these. And amidst a handful of great deep-cut RPGs that start with E, like Evo, Elnard, or Energy Breaker, I instead decided to take a look at Emerald Dragon, a Super Famicom conversion of a game that started out on Japanese PCs in 1989, and was eventually overhauled for the PC Engine CD in 1994. And while the 1995 Super Famicom port is trimmed down a bit from that due to reduced storage size and technical capabilities, it's still a super solid and engaging adventure, and the only current version of the game with a full fan translation in English. The plot takes place in a fantasy realm with dragons and humans, in a world where they once peacefully coexisted, but an evil lord placed a curse upon the land to kill the dragons, so they lived separately in exile on the island Draguria for many years. The game opens up with a young human girl ending up shipwrecked on the island, where she is raised as one of their own, but eventually she feels pulled to return to the human realm. You play as a Torushan, a dragon dedicated to her care, and you soon gain the ability to transform into a human in order to protect her, and become entangled in a quest to thwart the evil lord and undo the curse. The story is really well supported here, with lots of fun dialogue between the game's many characters, including some really nice artwork for the character portraits, and the chance to interact with your party with a party chat command. Gameplay takes the form of a generally traditional turn-based RPG, although the combat sequences do have a screen where you can strategically move yourself around to make attacks or defend yourself. And one minor gripe here is that you can only control the main character, a Tortushan. Everyone else is controlled by AI. So really your main priority is just keeping yourself alive while your teammates automatically deal damage and heal everyone else as needed. Auto battling is certainly nice while grinding experience points and whatnot, but I generally prefer to have that as an option instead of a requirement. Aside from that, Emerald Dragon is straightforward but really just a pleasure to play through, with a well-paced story and just enough polish to stand up fairly well to other heavy hitters on the system. And I'll refrain from making a very cheesy joke here, so let's just get into Feta, the emblem of justice, an admittedly derivative but still solid tactical RPG released on the Super Famicom in 1994. With the word emblem in the title, and also hiring the same character designer that worked on Sega's hit game Shining Force, at first glance this probably appears to be biting hard from Fire Emblem and Shining Force, and that first glance is really not wrong. Taking place on the war-torn planet Mildress Gars, your main character Brian and snarky wolf buddy Ain are both getting a little tired of being commanded to kill innocent people, so you abandon the Balfourian army and your grand adventure of rebellion begins. Gameplay is rather similar to Shining Force, with turn-based tactical battles on a large grid-based map, interspersed with top-down exploration sections where you further the story, interact with NPCs, and upgrade your equipment. The fighting interactions even retain a very similar look and feel to Shining Force, with some nice graphical interludes for each turn of combat. And even the translation makes some Shining Force jokes, as it's really pretty obvious where their main inspirations came from. There is at least one substantial aspect that sets Feta apart in the game's emblem system. Basically, your emblem represents your current alignment, ranging from chaotic to lawful, and is affected by your actions on the battlefield, such as how many enemies you kill, how often your party members take damage, or how you approach various mission objectives. Your emblem can affect many things like the characters you can recruit or how much experience points you can gain, and will also determine the ending. So this aspect can add some interesting challenges along with some additional replay value if you care to see all 4 possible endings. I do feel this game is a bit lacking in comparison to its inspirations, but it's still really decent from what I've seen. It's certainly worth a look if you're into this style of tactical RPG. It also received a remake on the Sega Saturn with some added cutscenes, characters, and gameplay balancing, and also even got a sequel on the PS1. For the letter G, we have another tactical RPG up next here with Galaxy Robo, published by Imagineer in 1994 and developed by Copia System, a name you'll see pop up again in a few more letters. So this game is so overlooked that it doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, but still does have a solid fan-made translation, so I figured I'd give it a shot here today. The story is a somewhat shallow sci-fi setup about 3 warring planets that use giant robots to fight each other, but the scenarios do have a fair amount of dialogue to keep things moving along and establish some of the many characters on your side and the opposing. Structure-wise, the tactical battles are at the forefront here, as you proceed to each encounter without much of a break and engage in turn-based combat on a large grid-based map, with the obligatory cool little animated fight sequences. Stylistically, this one feels a little more derivative of Fire Emblem than Shining Force, if we're comparing inspirations anyway, but obviously with a variety of futuristic giant mecha units replacing warriors and wizards, and considerably less polish. I haven't gotten too far into this one yet, as it was actually more challenging than I expected, and I had to make quite a few attempts on the second scenario to figure out how to survive. But it does seem like a pretty solid entry in the genre, and may be worth a look for tactics enthusiasts. And fans of the SNES mouse rejoice, this is also one of the handful of titles that can utilize that accessory. For letter H, we'll check out the 3rd entry in the Heracles no Eiko series. a series you might know as Glory of Heracles, as it was called when one of its later titles finally came to the West with a Nintendo-published release on the DS handheld in 2008. Prior to that, Heracles was seemingly Data East's answer to the Dragon Quest series, with 2 games for the Famicom, 1 for the Game Boy, and 2 for the Super Famicom, all steeped in Greek mythology and with very similar straightforward traditional RPG gameplay and mechanics. The third game puts you in control of a young man with amnesia who soon discovers he is immortal and sets out to contact the gods for guidance and restore balance to the chaotic world he has awoken in. As mentioned earlier, this one has some heavy Dragon Quest inspiration all around, from the aesthetics to the turn-based combat to the lighthearted tone of the story. I had to crack up as the means of finding your first party member was by demonstrating your shared superpower of being able to safely jump off of a building. Now, whether you regard this as a cheap Dragon Quest knockoff or as a comfy warm blanket is up to you here. But I really liked what I played of this one so far, and dipping into it has got me wanting to check out the entire series, honestly. And as a kid who watched Jason and the Argonauts over and over again, Greek mythology has always been a pretty interesting setting for me as well. Heracles no Ico 4 is also on the Super Famicom and also looks really nice, and from what I can tell, the stories are not directly connected, so you might be able to skip straight to that one if you want something a bit more polished looking. Next up, we have Inindo, Way of the Ninja, developed and published by Koei in 1991, along with several different home computer versions in Japan. And it even got an official localized release in North America in 1993. While Koei at the time were more renowned for their deep tactical war simulation games like Nobunaga's Ambition and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Inindo seems to be an attempt to cross over into more traditional RPG territory while still keeping the story within the era of feudal Japan. You play as an Iga ninja in the year 1582, whose village was destroyed by the warlord Nobunaga, and you must defeat him by the year 1601 in order to complete the game. To level yourself up, you'll explore a rather vast and open world, often delving into dungeons full of various monsters. Combat is turn-based, and there are some tactics involved as you can take various positions on the screen and select from short or long-range attacks for starters, and eventually you can guide your character's path of progress towards more magical abilities. You'll also need to recruit some more party members in the various towns scattered about, usually by hitting up the local tea houses and trying to convince them to join your cause. There are also some mild war sim gameplay mechanics going on as well, as to reach Nobunaga, you must gain the favor of various warlords by completing various tasks for them and joining battles to take control of any provinces necessary to open up your route. While this does add a nice bit of depth to the gameplay, admittedly this is not the nicest looking or sounding game for its release date, as it really has more of an early 90s PC game feel to it, and understandably so. It's honestly a little bit of a shock that this got localized at all. Maybe they were banking on the popularity of ninjas at the time, but this is certainly an odd duck amongst other RPGs that got North American releases. And while JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is far from what I would call an overlooked anime and manga series, and it certainly has seen its fair share of video games created, especially in the last 10 years or so, but personally, I hadn't heard much about the very first video game based on the series, released for the Super Famicom in 1993, developed by Winkysoft. I won't pretend to be knowledgeable about the series, other than what I've seen in random memes here and there, but from what I've read, apparently the story for this one loosely follows the third story arc from Stardust Crusaders, while the gameplay takes bits and pieces from visual novels, point-and-click adventures, along with plenty of RPG elements. It has a pretty interesting side-scrolling view with large character sprites moving along a constricted letterboxed viewing area, where you can interact with the environment and other characters, and eventually add more party members and battle enemy stand users before eventually facing off with Dio. Battles are turn-based, with combat options ranging from standard attacks to trying to have conversations with your opponents, or you can use tactics, which can sometimes trigger your character to have an idea, which will have various results, or there are also guts attacks that potentially do heavy damage. There are also tarot cards pulled before battle that have different effects, and some may be used during the fights as well. So there is plenty to do in the combat here, but at least early on, things feel somewhat scripted, so you may just need to go through some trial and error to know how to get through certain fights safely. Overall, it's got some interesting ideas thrown about in a rather unpolished but unorthodox fashion, so it might be worth a look, especially if you're a fan of the source material. Next up on the list is Kawa no Nushi 32, a Super Famicom installment of the charming Legend of the River King series, which has seen a few releases across various consoles and even a few North American releases. Unfortunately, this particular one hasn't received any kind of English translation that I could find, but as it's somewhat aimed at a younger audience, the Japanese may be basic enough to fumble your way through with Google Translate and figure out a few things on your own. You can play as one of 4 different members of the family, go fishing in 6 different areas, and also get in little random turn-based battles with various critters wandering around. It looks pretty cute, but yeah, since it's not in English yet, I don't have much else to say here, and it was the only RPG I could find that starts with K, so there we have it. And next up, we've got the very spooky La Place No Ma, originally a Japanese PC game released in 1987, and ported to a variety of other platforms until finally finding a home on the Super Famicom 8 years later in 1995. It takes place in Boston, Massachusetts in 1924, where you'll investigate a haunted mansion on the outskirts of town in search of a missing girl, and the cause behind other murders and disappearances. You can pick from a variety of classes for yourself and companions, each with distinct and unique capabilities, such as the journalist who can take photos of monsters for cash, a scientist who can use all sorts of wondrous machines, a medium with psychic abilities, and a detective good with combat, or the all-rounder dabbler. It might feel very reminiscent of Sweet Home to you if you know that game, another survival horror RPG classic on the Famicom from 1989. But just add in a bit more of those classic grinding mechanics, as you'll need to gain experience and money to evolve your characters a bit and upgrade your equipment in the nearby shops. Otherwise, one misstep into a new area before you're strong enough will surely lead to your demise. It's definitely a unique RPG title here in a genre that rarely leaned into horror elements in that time, and has some interesting tactics and mechanics thanks to the depth of character abilities, and goes hard on Lovecraftian themes if you're into that sort of setting. Now here we have another entry in a Data East-made RPG series with Metal Max Returns, a remake of the first game in the franchise originally released on the Famicom in 1991, and overhauled for the Super Famicom in 1995. Metal Max would become a fairly prolific series in Japan, and would eventually first come to North America with the release of Metal Saga on the PS2. But I find Metal Max Returns to be a pretty nice introduction to the series that adds some nice quality of life improvements and graphical updates to the original. Metal Max is set in a post-apocalyptic world where people are fighting to survive and there's a high demand for monster hunters. It's a typical turn-based console RPG at its core, but differentiates itself from games like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy with a much more open world, structured by choosing various missions you'd like to undertake in any order you'd like. You can even just end the game whenever you want to, with the ending altered by your list of accomplishments. So maybe just heading out into the field, finishing one job, and retiring happy is your thing. I won't judge. Another very notable aspect of Metal Max is a focus on vehicular combat and customization. While you can fight little critters out in the wilds on your own, if you want to get serious, you need a tank. You can get 8 different vehicles throughout the course of the game, with loads of ways to customize their loadouts and equip them with various items and weapons. So there are so many ways you can approach the game's many missions available. And despite the open-ended structure, there's still plenty of story to be experienced as well, if you care to seek that out. Now, whether you play the Famicom original or this remake, both with well-made fan translations, I'd say this is a great entry in the library of SNES RPGs and really worth a look. Now, the letter N proved to be a difficult one to track down a typical RPG, so I'll have to make a bit of a stretch here with Noigir Umi Tokaze no Kodo, an action-adventure title with some very light RPG elements, but I'll call it close enough here. Developed by Wolf Team and published by Telenet in 1993, this game was also planned for a North American release as The Journey Home: Quest for the Throne, but was ultimately cancelled when the planned publisher, Renovation, was bought by Sega that year. The story is about a young duke on a quest to save his homeland of Neugierr, which is German for curiosity, and uses a top-down perspective and real-time combat for its gameplay, as you have a sword and grappling hook at your disposal, along with the ability to jump and move around some objects. As mentioned, it goes very light on the RPG elements, with some basic equipment upgrades and a very rudimentary leveling system for your standing attack and jumping attack, which will each gradually improve the more you use them. But beyond that, this honestly sits more firmly in the action-adventure genre. It's also a bit on the short side, and it has a pretty derivative story, and certainly has some rough edges around some elements of the design, especially once you get into some of the janky platforming. But overall, it's still a fun and very serviceable little hack-and-slash adventure for fans of games like Lagoon or Link to the Past. And it does have some interesting notoriety for it being one of the first games worked on by Yoshiharu Gotanda, who would go on to found Tri-Ace, the developers of the Star Ocean series. And it also features music by Yukihiro Takahashi of Yellow Magic Orchestra fame. While Ogre Battle is probably technically the only true SNES RPG that starts with O, I feel like that amazing game is pretty well known already. So let's make another weird stretch here with Obidus, a rather obtuse dungeon crawler developed by Psygnosis for Amiga, Atari ST, DOS, and of course the Super Nintendo, with Bulletproof Software publishing this particular version. Now, unless you really love busting out the graph paper and making some maps, this may be a tough one to get into, with a lot of the game taking a first-person perspective, wandering through mazes of very similar-looking corridors, all the while your health and stamina candles are melting away, and with plenty of random enemies popping up in your path, which are dealt with in basic real-time combat. You can also pick up items and meet various NPCs in your journey, but the world of Obidus can be really harsh if you don't have much of a plan for what you're doing. Eventually, there are also perspective shifts to a side-scrolling action-oriented view if you can live to see them. But admittedly, this really isn't much of an RPG at all, as it's lacking any experience point gains, character progression, or even equipment upgrades. The focus is really on the exploration and action elements, so it may be of interest to hardcore fans of the dungeon crawler genre, and honestly, it might feel more at home on one of the computer-based platforms. And P is for Paladin's Quest, an off-kilter sci-fi themed RPG developed by Kopya Systems, published by Asmik in Japan in 1992 under the title Lennis, and localized and published by Enix for North America in 1993. In hindsight, it certainly does seem a bit odd that Enix would release oddities like this instead of localizing, Dragon Quest 5 and 6, but I'm not one to complain about getting access to weird games. And Paladin's Quest certainly sets itself apart in a few ways, and I'll never forget it after playing it back when it came out. game takes place in a fantasy world mixing together futuristic technology and magic, perhaps taking some thematic inspirations from Sega's Phantasy Star series. You play as a young magic school student named Chesney, who is bullied into climbing the Forbidden Tower of Gabnid, and in the process unleashes an ancient machine which wipes out the entire school and his classmates. Kinda messed up, really. Your teacher survives and basically tasks you with saving the world to atone for this, no big deal. The gameplay is very in line with traditional console RPGs, with a top-down overworld to explore and random turn-based battle encounters. The first obvious thing that sets this apart is its distinct aesthetic. While lacking the highly detailed pixel artwork of other competing games at the time, it has a rather psychedelic look reminiscent of Mobius or something, and a muted pastel-flavored color palette. It may not be for everyone's taste, but I applaud the attempt for a unique style here. Some of the mechanics also veer off the beaten path, notably the lack of magic points for your characters, so instead every spell you cast will just drain your health. And your magic abilities are also gradually progressed by using them, instead of just going off the experience points gained in battle. It also lacks traditional healing spells, so you use an equipped bottle of medicine to restore your health and can pay to get it refilled in item shops in the world's various towns. Paladin's quests can also be quite challenging, so be ready for some grinding if you want to survive the frequent enemy encounters and damage sponge monsters. You can at least hire a variety of mercenaries throughout the course of the game to help you out, and other main story characters in your party. And without spoiling too much, some of them can be on the eccentric side. Overall, Paladin's Quest certainly has a lot of slog to deal with to get through to its conclusion, and some frustrating design aspects at times, but I still found it to be a pretty interesting experience to see how it tries to stand apart from other similar games. It also received a sequel in Japan, Lennis 2, which I haven't tried yet, but looks pretty gorgeous, honestly, and I hope to give that a spin someday. And for letter Q, it should be no surprise here to be taking a look at Q*bert 3. Okay, so yeah, unless you count an unreleased port of the Amiga side-scroller Quick the Thunder Rabbit, Q*bert 3 is the only game on the system that starts with Q, and is by no means an RPG. So we'll move on to the next letter. And we've got another oddball Enix-published RPG here with Robotrek, co-developed by Ancient and Quintet, who would be well known for SNES classics like ActRaiser, Soul Blazer, and Terranigma, just to name a few. At first look, its general vibes may come off as an RPG aimed at younger audiences, but it actually has a fairly unique and interesting approach to its gameplay. You play as the child and apprentice of a master inventor, and early on in the game you create your first of 3 robots, and are quickly tasked to restore order to your world plunged into chaos by the hackers. It sounds kinda serious, but everything has a pretty silly and lighthearted vibe, and there are plenty of quirky characters to interact with and lots of humorous dialogue. Once you get your first robot customized to your liking and start adventuring out in the world, you'll notice combat sequences are instigated by contact with enemies on screen instead of randomly. Your robot can move around to various points on the battlefield, and you have a variety of different attacks and abilities depending on how you've built it. Your different actions use up a certain amount of energy, which is then gradually restored, and once your meter is full again, you can take your next action. It really introduces a lot of strategy and depth in how you tweak your robo-buddy and approach different situations. Different parts can be acquired out in the world, but more often you'll need to study up and learn new instructions for building parts yourself, and combining various items in your workshop. It's a bit confusing at first, despite this coming off as a kiddie RPG, so the complexity and open-endedness is surprising, and welcomed if you're looking for something different here. Overall, Robotrek's charming atmosphere and unique gameplay is definitely worth the trek. Letter S brings us to Shadowrun, the first of a handful of video games based on the cyberpunk-themed tabletop role-playing game system, developed by Beam Software and published by Data East in 1993. More specifically, the story here pulls from the first Shadowrun novel, Never Deal with a Dragon, and puts you in control of a guy named Jake who wakes up in a morgue drawer with amnesia. You begin to investigate the circumstances surrounding your attempted assassination and the identity of the mysterious shapeshifter who saved your life. Gameplay settles somewhere in the realm of action RPG, but with a lot of point-and-click adventure elements as well, and all with an isometric perspective. You can move around freely and also utilize a cursor for interacting with the environment, and also for real-time gunfights and eventual magical combat. And man, there are a lot of random people in this place that want you dead. There are many NPCs to interact with. You get quite a few dialogue options to pick from during these conversations to try and extract some more useful information from the people you meet. Like Dog, who controls your destiny. I mean, why wouldn't he? You can also hack into computer systems with your cyber deck and level up and customize your character with an interesting karma point system. So there's quite a surprising amount of depth here, resulting in a very unique experience on the Super Nintendo for the time, despite being a bit rough around the edges. It went through quite a bit of development hell before the lead programmer of Nightshade for the NES was brought on board and had to wrap up the game in a few short months. So in that regard, it's a pretty impressive accomplishment. And if you like this gritty cyberpunk universe, definitely check out the Sega Genesis Shadowrun game as well for a completely different 16-bit take. And now we'll take a look at Tengai Makyo Zero, a Super Famicom exclusive installment of the Tengai Makyo series, also known as Far East of Eden. Now this is actually a pretty popular series overseas, standing strong alongside juggernauts like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy at the time, ever since the series' first title was released on the PC Engine CD, which also has the claim to fame of being the first console RPG in that format. The second game in the series was also a pretty big deal, becoming the most expensive game production to date at the time, with a development budget of 500 million yen. Tengai Makyo Zero would be the first appearance of the series on the Super Famicom in 1995, scaling things down to cartridge constraints, but still utilizing a custom chip to cram as much music, dialogue, and great graphics as they could onto the cart, resulting in a really gorgeous and epic adventure. I'll admit I haven't gotten too far into this one yet, as I kinda want to check out some of the earlier titles first, but even the first hour of this game feels like this is something pretty special. It takes place in Jipang, a fantasy-filled feudal Japan setting, and you play as the young Higan, who quickly learns he is the fabled fire hero, and sets out on a grand adventure to fight against the evil Niningi, the ruler of hell. As mentioned before, the production value here feels very high, with great graphics and an incredible soundtrack, with gameplay being pretty comparable to Dragon Quest with its exploration and combat mechanics. One other unique thing here, however, is the use of a real time clock on the cartridge, where the current date tracked by the game, which you enter in upon the first time loading it up, will affect things like when certain shops are open or closed, special in-game events and holiday celebrations, or even keeping track of your birthday. It's definitely a cool one to check out, and does fortunately have a great translation patch. Now let's set sail for the letter U and head out into Uncharted Waters, another Koei simulation RPG hybrid title, this one focusing on life at sea during the Age of Discovery. It was originally released on the PC-88, but also received versions on the MSX, NES, Sega Genesis, and the Super Nintendo version seen here. You play as Leon Franco from Portugal, determined to restore glory to your family name on the open ocean. I'll admit, despite the wetness of the title and setting, this one is a bit on the dry side for me, but if you're into managing resources and finances paired with slow-paced and methodical exploration, you might sink deep into this one. It also received a sequel worth mentioning, Uncharted Waters: New Horizons, which leans a bit more into traditional RPG territory with a lot more dialogue and story to get into, and in turn a lot more approachable, but still retaining its open-ended nature along with the deep simulation elements that made the original a success. It also has 6 different characters and storylines to pick from, so there's a lot more content to play through here as well. Again, these are a bit out of my wheelhouse, or boathouse, but there's certainly notable RPG simulation hybrids on the console with many fathoms of depth. Next up, I'll quickly touch on Vern World, a Japanese exclusive game from 1995 that sadly has yet to receive an English translation, but it still looks pretty interesting regardless. The premise surrounds a Jules Verne-themed amusement park in the year 2028, where you and your kid brother become trapped in the park and of course embark on a wild adventure to try and escape and reunite with your family. So it provides a pretty interesting setting for referencing classic novels like Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Around the World in 80 Days. And it has a kind of goofy, Earthbound-like vibe to it. It seems pretty charming on the surface, albeit perhaps on the simple side of things. But I'm really doing a lot of guessing here due to the language barrier. Crossing my fingers for a patch on this one someday. Otherwise, you'll either need to use a walkthrough or be able to read Japanese. And beyond the generally beloved and many wizardry games on the console, I had a tricky time finding something more obscure for this letter, but I dug up an interesting looking, but also sadly untranslated title with Wondrous Magic, developed by System Seicom and published by ASCII in 1993. I unfortunately can't relay much about the plot here, and there's a general lack of information online about this, but hey, this weird 3D-ish battle system is kinda cool. The interface is certainly unique, and you don't often see this mechanic requiring you to spin yourself around in various directions to deal with the monsters closing in on you. But as mentioned, it's not translated, so I don't have much else to report on this one. I'm curious if anyone out there actually does. The letter X is also a tricky letter to find a game to fit into these alphabet lists, but luckily we've got a pretty solid pick here with Zack, The Art of Visual Stage, an action RPG developed by Microcabin. This title got its start on the PC-88, but eventually also received ports to other Japanese computer platforms, the PC Engine, and the Super Famicom. It's a little on the generic side with a high fantasy setting, young heroes saving the world from demons storyline. Yeah, we've kinda already seen this a lot in this very video. But stylistically, it also comes off very similarly to the East series, although the action probably feels a bit more Lagoon-like, with an itty-bitty sword to be swinging around as opposed to bump combat mechanics. Despite it feeling a bit derivative, I found the gameplay to feel pretty solid, and it has a challenging edge to it as well, along with decent graphics and sound for the presentation, so you could probably do a lot worse while digging through the vast sea of action-adventure games. It's probably worth a look if you're into this type of game, and you might also want to look at the handful of sequels it received on Japanese computers, including an installment on the PC Engine CD. Speaking of Ys, it's letter Y time, and Ys is the only option. While this is hardly an overlooked series these days with how much it has grown over the years and has a pretty massive fan base, we could still take a look at one of 2 titles in the series for the Super Famicom which didn't get released for North American audiences at the time, despite the localized release of Ys 3. So here is Ys 4, Mask of the Sun, which chronologically takes place between the events of Ys 2 and 3, and is not to be confused with a different Ys 4, The Dawn of Ys, for the PC Engine CD. You can't confuse it with Memories of Celceta if you want though, the somewhat recent reimagining taking place in that same point in time. but the actual remake was made for PS2. Now, before I confuse myself further, let's just get into the gameplay here, which is a grand return of the real-time bump combat of the earlier games, ditching the side-scrolling action introduced in Ys 3. Now, I have a soft spot for Ys 3 with it being my introduction to the franchise back when it came out, but I can kinda see why it wasn't very well received at the time in the grand scope of the series. But speaking of not well received, Ys 4 also had its development outsourced to Tonkin House instead of being made by Falcom. So it does feel a bit like a discounted and rehashed take on the earlier games, but just plopped onto the Super Famicom. And it does seem kinda lacking for any fresh ideas, but luckily that classic Ys formula is still just good, so you can't go too wrong here in my opinion. Finally, for the final letter, we've got one last big reach here with 04 Champ RR, part racing game and part life simulator with some light RPG elements. Let's go. It's sadly no translation patch here, but I can at least gather that you play as a kid aspiring to be a pro drag racer, and the game alternates between actual racing and just surviving, where you will be working a part-time job as a security guard, getting involved with the local racing community, and gradually leveling up various aspects of your life. It's actually a kind of a cool game concept. It would be pretty neat if it ever gets an English version someday. And that wraps up our A to Z list here. Hopefully you discovered something new to play after watching this, or maybe it reminded you of something lingering in the backlog. If you've got another RPG deep cut that wasn't mentioned, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you like this alphabetical format, make sure to check out my recent A to Z list of brutally difficult NES games. And thanks so much for watching, we'll catch you next time.